Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Ingarani me Piripini te whakapapāranga mai, ko Leicester me Bristol te whenua tupu, ko Tamaki Makaurau te Kāinga, he Industry Research Liaison Manager o I New Zealand Food Safety Science and Research Centre, ko Kyla Archer toku ingoa, tēnā koutou katoa. On behalf of the New Zealand Food Safety Science and Research Centre, I'd like to welcome you all to the August edition of the Food Science Seminar Spotlight of 2023. I hope you're all well and having a good day, and thanks for spending an hour with us this afternoon. Today's speaker is Peter Cressy from ESR, who I expect a lot of you already know, and he will be talking to us about food safety risk analysis at an international level. He'll be discussing the interdependent functions of risk assessment, risk management, and risk communication, and the structure of the different global bodies involved and how their activities may influence our local food safety environment. So thank you for taking the time to present to us today, Peter. We'll follow up with a Q&A session after your presentation. So if you have any questions, please enter them into the Q&A box at the bottom and I will raise them later. Okay, thank you, Peter.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I can't see anybody or any numbers or anything, but I trust you're all out there. I'll just get my presentation up on the screen. No, not that one. It always has to happen, doesn't it? No matter how well you prepare. There we go. Okay. And we need to get back to the beginning. Okay, here we go. So food safety risk analysis at an international level. I'm sorry, this is not going to be that exciting. There's no notable jokes in here, and there's definitely no car chases or other action scenes. But what I hope to do with this seminar is there's a lot of names of organisation and terms that get kicked around in the food safety space. And I'm hoping to be able to kind of draw a bit of a map so you can see how those relate to one another and have an idea of what their functions are. So start with this, the general picture of risk analysis. So risk analysis, as Kyla stated, has three interdependent functions: risk assessment, risk management, and risk communication. Today, I'll mainly be talking about the risk assessment and the risk management. So just take the risk communication away to one side for a while. In this diagram, we see these two circles as overlapping, and indeed, in the way they operate, there does need to be an overlap, and that there needs to be exchange of information between risk managers and risk assessors. However, at another level, there needs to be kind of an iron curtain almost between them, and that the risk managers should state what their risk management questions are to be answered by the risk assessment, but they should not influence the risk assessment. Similarly, the risk assessors should attempt to answer the risk management questions, but they should not try to influence the decisions that the risk managers will then make as to how to manage those risks. If we look firstly at our local level to see how this works, we have two main risk management bodies that we will be familiar with. The first is the bilateral Australia-New Zealand Food Standards Authority, Food Standards Australia-New Zealand, that's right, who derive standards, develop standards for Australia and New Zealand. So we see here explicitly in a quote from them, FSSANZ develop standards that regulate the use of ingredients, process aids, colorings, additives, vitamins, and minerals. So this is clearly a risk management function. They are regulating, they're developing standards. Again, a quote from FSSANZ. FSSANZ use risk analysis to manage the diverse range of food-related health risks. So they're very explicitly a risk management organisation, but they're also a risk assessment and a risk communication organisation. And you'll see this at various levels where organisations carry out both the functions of risk assessment and risk management, and often risk communication, but need to manage those interfaces internally. So here in New Zealand, we have the Ministry for Primary Industries and their business unit of the New Zealand Food Safety. And they also say similar things. In addressing MPI's purpose of growing and protecting New Zealand, we need to substantially increase the value of primary sector exports while managing risks. So they're explicitly managing risks there. And in supporting the MPI strategic priorities, we provide evidence-based advice and risk assessment. So they're also quite explicit about the fact that they are carrying out both those functions, the risk assessment and the risk management. So if we then move to an international level, and the body with the real global mandate is the United Nations, and there are two organisations within the United Nations umbrella who have responsibilities related to the safety of the food supply. The World Health Organization, and once again we have a direct quote here, WHO aims to enhance the capacity to prevent, detect and respond to public health threats associated with unsafe food at the global and country levels. So this is very explicit here. They have responsibilities for food safety, and it's at both a global level and then with helping individual countries. The role of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO, in the food chain is very much more explicit. All aspects of their mandate have to do with food, and food safety is one of those. So healthy diets, nutrition for the most vulnerable, safe food for everyone, reducing food waste and loss, and transparent markets and trade. And the transparent markets and trade is a very important driver for the risk management functions that are carried out by these organisations. So these two UN organisations got together, decided they had common ground on food safety, and back in 1963 they established a body known as the Codex Alimentarius Commission, or Codex as most people call it on a day-to-day basis. So Codex Alimentarius is about safe, good food for everyone, everywhere. So again, you see this kind of global mandate and the central role of food safety in that mandate. So it is a joint FAO-WHO program established in '63. The Secretariat, known as the Joint FAO-WHO Food Standards Program, is located physically within the FAO headquarters in Rome. The Codex Alimentarius Commission is kind of like the umbrella body. It's what do you call it? It's like a president to a number of senators or something like that. And the substantive work carried out by Codex is carried out through a series of committees. And these are either subject-based, commodity-based, or known as coordinating committees. So we have some examples here, and I've tried to focus particularly for the subject committees on those related to food safety. And this is where you'll start to see some acronyms that some of you at least will be familiar with. So the Codex Committee on Contaminants in Food, CCCF, looks at basically any contaminant, and that's things like metals and mycotoxins, things like PFAS are starting to come onto their agenda. So all sorts of things that are not either additives or residues. There's a separate committee, CCFA, that looks at food additives. There's a microbiologically focused committee, the Codex Committee on Food Hygiene, and New Zealand's very active in that. And then there are two committees related to residues of intentionally used substances, so pesticides and veterinary drugs. We then have some examples of the commodity committees, fish and fisheries, fresh fruit and vegetables, etc. There used to be a lot more of these commodity-based committees, but a lot of them have gone into abeyance, and the issues with particular foods tend to be more often dealt with through the subject committees. And lastly, down the bottom, we see the coordinating committees for various regions of the world. So the UN organization likes to divide the globe up into manageable chunks. And in this case, those manageable chunks are Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America and the Caribbean, North America and Southwest Pacific, where we sit, and the Near East. So these Codex committees meet annually, no kind of fixed venues. They tend to rotate around a number of member countries. The next is perhaps the most important point I want to make. The participants in the Codex committees are representatives of the member nations or member organizations. So they are specifically there to protect or promote the interests of their country. Some intergovernmental and non-governmental organisations also participate in the committees, mainly as observers. And there's some well-known names here: the Commission on Microbiological Specifications for Food and the International Dairy Federation are frequent observers to certain of the Codex committees. So the Codex committees produce or work towards producing a range of outputs. And these outputs can be standards, they can be guidelines, or they can be codes of practice. And for the residue committees, they can be maximum limits, maximum residue limits, or maximum limits, which in a way are another sort of standard. They're a mandating sort of directive, whereas the guidelines and the codes of practice tend to be a little bit more gentle in their approach. The development of the outputs is progressed by working groups, and this is where the representative function of the participants comes in, and that if a particular topic is seen to be of particular concern to a country, you'll often find that that country will stick up their hand and ask to be part of the working group. And New Zealand have been leaders of a number of working groups, particularly on issues that they saw as being particularly pertinent to our agricultural outputs. All of this, the operations, the risk analysis, procedures are outlined in a procedural manual. So this is kind of like the Bible that the Codex committees need to refer back to make sure they're playing by the rules. Okay, so here's some examples of the outputs. There are standards for almost any food you can think of. Here a standard for preserved tomatoes. Then there are some general standards, and these are biggies, and the two biggies are the general standard for contaminants and toxins in food and feed, and then there is another general standard for food additives, and these are quite large documents. And then we get into the guidelines, principles and guidelines for the establishment and application of microbiological criteria related to food. So Codex do not develop microbiological criteria themselves, but they lay out guidelines for individual countries to develop their own criteria. There's guidelines for the conduct of pesticide residue labs, and then a couple of examples of codes of practice. A code of hygienic practice for low and acidified, low acid canned foods, our code of practice for the reduction of hydrocyanic acid, so it's hydrogen cyanide, and cassava products. So some of these codes of practice are quite general. They're aimed at a commodity grouping or several commodity groupings. Then others are quite specific around trying to manage or reduce a particular problem. So now we jump over to the risk assessment side. And once again, it's the same two bodies who manage this process, so FAO and WHO, through what they call their scientific advice program. And this scientific advice is provided predominantly to the Codex committees, but can also be provided to other, usually UN organizations. For instance, I was involved in offering some advice to the World Food Programme. The World Food Programme produces and provides food to something like 70 million people on the planet, I think, and they had a contamination incident with some of their products and needed scientific advice. There are five expert committees here, but there are three main ones that relate to food safety. That's the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives, which is very much a misnomer, as you'll see in a minute. The Joint Meetings on Pesticide Residues, which is not a misnomer, and the Expert Meetings on Microbiological Risk Assessment. There are two further expert committees that are not strictly food safety related. So it's the meetings on pesticide specifications and the expert meeting on nutrition. Now, you can argue, I guess, whether nutrition is a safety issue or not, but we will leave it off to the side for the time being. So the expert committees are formed in response to a request for science advice, usually from a Codex committee, but occasionally from another UN organisation. And at the end of each of the committee meetings, they have a section in their report of issues that they wish to refer to one or other of the expert committees. The participants for the expert committees are drawn from expert rosters, and now we have the counterpart to the point I made with the Codex committees. Participants are involved due to their individual expertise and are not representatives of a country or organisation. And this is hammered into you, and you have to sign your life away to say that you are there in your personal capacity and not representing your country. A particular committee only exists for the duration of a specific advice provision. So this will be a period of months before the meeting, then a physical meeting, and then the tidying up of the various reports after the meeting. Other than that, people can claim to be a member of the expert roster, but not of the committee unless they are sitting on a committee at that time. Except on very rare occasions, the committees alternate their venues between Geneva and Rome, Geneva, the WHO headquarters, and Rome, the FAO headquarters. And you see off to the side here, at the top, a picture of the WHO building with Lake Geneva off in the background there. And at the bottom, the FAO building. There's an interesting story about the FAO building that it was built initially about the time of the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. And Mussolini had an absolute paranoia about being assassinated. So you find if you're at FAO that none of the meeting rooms have external windows to them. There's no opportunity for somebody to pop you off from the outside. I'm sorry, this is a pretty poor photo, but the FAO headquarters is particularly nicely located. They have a cafeteria on the 8th floor, and this is the view from the cafeteria at FAO. So in the bottom left-hand corner, you have the remains of the Circus Maximus, where they used to have the chariot races and all that sort of thing. Just above there, you see aspects of the Forum, which was the kind of business center for ancient Rome. And if you look down far enough on the mid right-hand side, you'll just catch sight of the Colosseum there. So FAO is very nicely located. So as I mentioned, the two organisations maintain rosters of experts in the area of additives, contaminants, natural toxins, etc. These are looked after by GECFA, and there is a WHO GECFA roster, an FAO GECFA roster. So this is people with expertise in the chemistry of the compounds, how they will react through the food chain, what the prevalence is in foods, etc. And then there is a much smaller roster of experts in dietary exposure assessment to chemicals. Then for the pesticide side, once again, FAO have their roster of experts. WHO have a roster of experts. And at this stage, they borrow their exposure assessment experts from the GECFA roster. The microbiological side only has a single roster of experts in risk assessment of microbiological hazards. And then there is another roster that I don't know too much about, but these are experts on foodborne antimicrobial resistance. Okay, so there's quite a tight relationship between the expert committees and the codex committees. As I mentioned, GECFA deals with issues referred to it by CCFA, that's food additives, CCCF, that's contaminants in food, and CC, that should be residues of veterinary drugs in food. So these three things come under the ambit of GECFA. There's a one-to-one relationship between JMPR, the Meeting on Pesticide Residues, and the Codex Committee on Pesticide Residues, and GEMRA service the needs of the Codex Committee on Food Hygiene. So it's the Expert Committee on Microbiological Risk Assessment. So here we have kind of encapsulated the risk management, risk assessment relationship at the UN level for food safety. Okay, so what do the committees do? And here, because it's my area of interest and expertise, I'll talk about the chemical committees. So that's GECFA and JMPR. Experts are invited onto the committee, and they are assigned to either a single compound or several compounds that are in the work program for that year. They'll either be assigned as a monographer, which means they write part of the various documents, or as a reviewer, which means they review the work of the specified monographer. The components that make up the assessments consider toxicology, epidemiology, chemistry of the compound, including composition. And when I say composition there, I mean things like the studies of the prevalence of the chemical in foods. There's dietary exposure assessment, and then kind of an emerging discipline, really, the dose response modeling. This used to be kind of just glossed over, but now there are specific experts to the committees in the area of dose response modeling. The experts will generally work on their assignments during the months before the meeting, and that's usually a period of probably about 6 months. So you're preparing material, you're having periodic meetings, which for us are horrendous and in the middle of the night because they're timed to be appropriate for European groups. And then it's sometime through the year there will be a physical meeting in either Rome or Geneva, covering a period of 8 days. So this is the substantive face-to-face part of the committees. And there are certain things that must be completed in that 8 working days and other things that can spill over a little bit. And during this time, the experts work on 2 main documents, a meeting report and the substance monograph. This is a typical sort of size for an expert committee. This was actually the 96th JECFA, which recently considered aspartame. So 30 to 40 people is generally about the size of group you're talking about. So these expert meetings produce a range of outputs. There's a brief summary report which comes out within about 2 weeks of the physical meeting. It says who was there and gives a very brief summary of what was considered. Then there is the blue book, the meeting report, and the text of the meeting report has to be finalised before the end of the physical meeting. Now, that's usually a perfunctory run through on the final day, but occasionally it spills on well into the afternoon. You can see people starting to get a bit tense because this has to be finished before they can go home. And this is a kind of a structured summary of the evaluation, but it is often the primary output that's digested by the Codex committees. I think there's a degree of kind of flippancy here, saying, well, you need a shorter report to meet the attention span of the risk managers. So this is what we'll give them. The monographs can be huge. They can be hundreds of pages, and they include all the details of the evaluation. And these are usually referred to as the yellow book that you can see in the top right-hand corner, although occasionally they're not quite yellow, as you can see in the document next to it. So I mentioned earlier on that Codex and its activities has a primary interest in international trade. And I'll just read out these 2 quotes for you because it kind of comes to the philosophical basis for setting up Codex in the first place. It was envisaged when Codex was founded that if all countries harmonised with internationally agreed standards, there would be fewer barriers to trade and food products would naturally move more freely amongst countries. This would benefit farmers and their households and contribute to reducing hunger and poverty. A fundamental part of Codex work, therefore, is contributing to ensure fair practices in food trade. If a country aligns its domestic food standards with Codex standards, then trading partners can operate on a level playing field. And then again below, the World Trade Organization, which is kind of the overseer for the trade processes, has specifically identified the standards, guidelines and recommendations established by the Codex Alimentarius Commission for additives, drugs, residues, etc. This means that Codex standards are considered scientifically justified and are accepted as the benchmark against which national measures and regulations are evaluated. So what we find internationally is that some countries will adopt Codex standards verbatim, and this is probably more common in countries where they're not resource rich. They don't have the resources to carry out the assessments themselves, so they adopt those from Codex. Other countries, probably the more resource-rich countries, and New Zealand is amongst those, tend to, in some cases, develop their own standards, but will usually reference them to Codex. And if there's a situation in trade between countries where there isn't an existing standard from either party, then the default standard is that is established by Codex. So it has an important, their standards have an important role in international trade, and if more people would harmonise with them, they could take an even more central role and reduce the problems. Okay, so we have New Zealanders involved in this process. The Codex committees, the participants there are mostly MPI staff, a various range of them, plus some industry representatives. Fonterra is often part of the New Zealand delegation to certain of the Codex committees. For the JECFA committee, there's myself. Tim Harwood from Cawthron has recently been appointed to the roster. Andrew Pearson, who used to be at MPI, now at Tonkin Taylor, is a member of the dietary exposure roster. And Stuart Creton and Rosalind Dalefield from Fazans and Wellington, members of the toxicology roster. For JMPR, Dave Lunn is probably the longest serving New Zealander on any of these committees. Dave's been involved with JMPR for probably a good 20 years now. And as far as I know, even though he's retired, he will continue. I've been involved with JMPR for a couple of years, and Stuart Creton will make his first appearance there this year. We have a few more people involved in the microbiological committee. Carlos Campos from Cawthron, Dorothy Jean McCoubry, who a number of you will know, then Anne-Marie Petchik, Marion, and Peter van der Lot from MPI. It's probably a good time for some personal observations. I think New Zealand has, for the size of the country, we have an advantage in participation in the committees and in the expert committees, and that the expert committees seek to include representatives from a broad range of countries. So New Zealand is seen as another country, but a country that is able to align and work very easily with representatives from North America and Europe, where the bulk of the expert committee members come from. The committees are quite an experience. You get to work closely with people whose perhaps names you've only seen on papers that you've read. It's an extremely collegial environment. Some nice locations, a little bit of time for socialising. So I guess my closing statement would be, if there's any of you out there who think you might like to participate in these processes, apply to go on the rosters of the expert committees. You know, you might be surprised. And that's all I've got to say for today.
Great, thanks, Peter. Sorry, I'm trying to find my video. There, right. Yeah, thank you for that. It's you know, not the, as you said, not the most thrilling of topics, but it's actually been really interesting. And as someone new to the food safety like research area myself, it's been helpful to know what all of those acronyms after your name mean in some of the articles that we've done. So yeah, if you have questions, please just pop them into the Q&A function, and I'll put them to Peter. I've got a couple of things as well. So you were just saying at the end, if people are interested in joining the expert panels to apply through that process, how long does that usually take?
The application process? Yeah, it's not too long. The committees vary a little bit. Some of them kind of are open permanently. Other ones have calls periodically where they'll call for new experts. So you complete a form, you fill in your CV, and you would usually hear within probably a couple of months. Once you're on the roster, the rosters operate for usually a 5-year period, but generally the roster will roll over to the next period unless you specifically ask to be removed from it. So you're more likely, if you do nothing, you're more likely to be included in the next roster rather than being excluded.
Well, that was my next question. And how many roughly in the expert committees? I'm sorry if I missed that before. I know you had the picture of everyone that was at the 96th meeting, but that's obviously a small representation of everybody that's
Yeah,
there.
the rosters vary in size. I mean, I'm guessing here, but the GEMRA one is quite a large roster, and that's probably 100 plus people, down to the dietary exposure assessment roster, which might only be 20, 25 people. The other rosters sort of sit in between that, probably 50 to 80 people on the roster at any time.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's nice to see such a large representation from New Zealand, as you said. So.
Yeah, I think we punch above our weight, as we do in a number of areas. And also in the Codex committees, New Zealand is a frequent leader of working groups. So again, in the Codex side, I think we punch above our weight.
That's great. It's kind of a how long's a piece of string, but when you have those reports, those outputs that come out of the meetings, how long do the recommendations from those outputs take to come into effect, or does it depend on what it is?
Well, the recommendations, whether they come into effect or not, is up to the risk managers. So the expert committees can make recommendations. Usually the recommendations they make are around improvements to the risk assessment. So they're more recommendations for the member countries than for the risk managers. The relationship with the risk managers is that we seek to answer the risk management questions they have, but it's then their job to decide what they do with that. And that is that division that I outlined at the beginning. We can give them the information to make their decisions, but we can't make those decisions for them.
That's a very simple, easy way of putting it.
Yeah.
And when are the next meetings, or the ones that you're involved in?
Yeah, so we're about 3 weeks out from the next JMPR meeting, and this unusually will be held in Washington because they're doing rebuilding at WHO in Geneva. So that's in this latter half of September. There will be another meeting of GECFA, the food additives part of GECFA, later in the year, I think about November. And then there will be a meeting of the GECFA veterinary drugs experts in February of next year. On the microbiological side, I'm not quite so up with the timetable, but I know that Joe Hewitt from our organisation is involved in a GEMRA assessment on viruses, and that's coming up, I think, in October. Yeah. And this is another thing, I mean, that a lot of the meetings are through the committees, but as I said, there are also the ad hoc consultations. And if the ad hoc consultation is squarely in your area of expertise, there is often the opportunity to put your hat in the ring just for that consultation. And Tim Harwood, prior to being on the GECFA panel, participated in ad hoc consultation around Ciguatera that was about 3 years ago, I think.
Yeah, great. Thank you. We've actually not had any questions come in. I think it's sign that you covered everything very thoroughly. Yeah, good. And so yeah, nice to have a few questions that I personally had just about kind of how how the process managed. And yeah, also thanks for sharing the photo of the Circus Maximus and the view out over Rome. It's you know, enviable to say the least.
Yeah, it's certainly a very nice spot up on, because there's an open balcony that comes out from the cafeteria, so you kind of feel a little bit special sitting out there with your espresso, looking out over the ruins of ancient Rome.
Oh, life is so hard. Okay. All right. Well, I'll close up now, but thank you again, Peter, for your time and our knowledge and your knowledge. This will be available on our website shortly under the event part of along the top. Thanks, Michael, for uploading that, along with all the previous webinars, and also the videos from our symposium are all available there now as well. Our next session is scheduled for Friday, the 22nd of September at 12 p.m. and is the rescheduled session with Frank Yanis. The registration details will be in your inboxes in the next week or so. So thank you everyone for staying to the end. Enjoy the rest of the week. Ka kite ano.
Thanks everyone. Have a good afternoon. See ya.
Oh, someone just commented and said, very informative presentation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I paid them. Okay, we'll see you soon, Carla.